So what do you think about when you think about heaven? Anything pop into your mind? What do you feel certain about? What do you have questions about? We asked a question earlier today. Would you show that slide for us, Taylor? So how many songs can you think of that have the word heaven in the title? So that's good. We can go back to the main slide there. Push the button again. There we go. Yeah. I just was wondering what songs, there's a lot of different songs, there's different movies, there's different ideas out there about heaven. Cartoons have a version of heaven, books have a version of heaven. And so we have all these competing ideas for heaven. If I were to talk about what pop culture says about heaven, we might use words like mansion or thrones or worship or angels floating on clouds, or all dogs go to heaven, right? So the most common thing Americans believe is that good people go to heaven. And so in spite of all of these stories and myths and mythology and fictions about heaven, what does the Bible say about heaven? And today what you're going to see is I'm going to invite you to go on a journey with me for the next 3 weeks back to the first century to figure out what did the earliest Christians believe about heaven. Because I find that to be a very interesting question. We know and if you're ever a kid and played this game, the game of telephone, where you start at one end of the room and you whisper something to your neighbor, and then we follow that all through the room, and by the time it gets to the back of the room, rarely does it even sound like what we said at the beginning of the room. And so there is this question that over 2,000 years now of Christianity existing, how much has it gotten distorted? Maybe a Xerox machine makes better sense for you, and so you make a copy, and you make another copy, and you make another copy, and how distorted is the image after a while? What is heaven like? And why are there so many competing visions of it in our culture? And why do so many of these competing visions of heaven not match much of what the earliest Christians believed? And that's the journey I want to go on with you. Back to the first church, back to the earliest Christians, the people that were closest to the resurrection of Jesus, the people that were involved in starting the church. What did they understand about heaven and the afterlife? In 2 Corinthians 4:18, this forms kind of the basis for our 3-week journey. He says, we don't look at troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. Things that outlast us. That is a very interesting topic because it's not one that we have much experience with. This series is going to focus on those things that do not end, those things that God creates to be eternal. You and I actually were originally designed and created for eternity. Things went wonky in Genesis chapter 3, unfortunately, and life became finite. But God had a bigger plan in mind, and he had a plan of restoring us to eternity. Listen for that word today. You're going to hear that word, and any time that you hear the word restoration or restore, know that it is important because that is a consistent theme we will talk about today, that God is in the restoration business. He is restoring that which was broken. Much as the first Adam brought destruction and break in the world, God is restoring through the second Adam, Jesus Christ. He is restoring that which is broken. This is the Bible's overarching meta-narrative, the big story of the Bible. What has happened in the beginning that connects to today, that connects to our future, our shared future together. Another vision of heaven, perhaps, I think is most interesting, is in Twilight Zone episode that dealt with this character in the fun hat over here on the right. Being a gangster, he was breaking the law, and police officers were chasing him, and he's trying to climb a fence, and they shoot, and he wakes up the next day, and he's in bed, and apparently someone's taken them under his wing, and he's all better now. And this guy here on the left never tells him his name, so he starts calling him affectionately Fats. He says, hey, Fats, where am I at? And hey, Fats this, and hey, Fats that. And the guy never says a word about it. And he says, what can I do for you? What can I provide for you? And he's like, well, I guess I could get some food. And he brings all this gorgeous food. And he says, well, I guess I could use a girlfriend. And so he brings a young lady to be his girlfriend. Well, I could use some fun, entertainment, and board. So he brings gambling in. He says, well, I'd like to rob a bank. And he's like, go ahead. And he gets through it all. And he's like, what is this place? I don't understand what's going on. He's like, well, you didn't survive that shot. He's like, oh, I'm dead. And I've gone to heaven. I never thought I'd make it. I'm here. And he keeps getting to rob banks. And he wins every game that he plays gambling. He wins. He said, I want $1 million, boss. And he goes, check the drawers of the desk. And $1 million just there. And he said, everything I've ever wanted. And then finally, by the end of the episode, he says, oh, man. He goes, Fats, I'm getting really bored here. I think you made a mistake. I want to go to the other place. This is not for me. And the end of the episode, which is classic, is the fella on the left here said, what made you think this was heaven? And he just laughs and laughs and laughs and laughs. And it's weird because the whole time you're thinking he's getting everything he wants. That's what heaven's got to be, right? Just getting my way constantly, getting everything, every desire I could ever want. Just everything me focused. And the kind of moral of the story, I guess, is no, that's a weird vision of it. Life is full of disappointments. This life you and I live is full of disappointments. But heaven is different. It's not boring. A lot of the time we think of it as boring. We see those cartoons and the angel playing the harp and we're like, I don't want to do that. What on earth? I don't want to float on a cloud all day and just kind of, ooh, right? I mean, that's kind of our vision. But God is a God of adventure. And he's inviting us into something that is much bigger than ourselves. God, our ultimate creator, who is immensely creative. He created all of us. He created this entire globe. He created the entire cosmos. He invites us and designs us to dream big dreams. And in heaven, those God-given dreams are beyond our wildest of imaginations today. There's no boredom. There's a world coming that is beyond our wildest imaginations. Anything we could write about, anything we could draw, anything we could put in CGI or make a movie about, pales in comparison to what God has in store for his creation. If we roll back to the Old Testament, there's a book called Ecclesiastes, one of my favorite books, and the writer there says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So it's as if God has created us and programmed us with a desire for eternity, to know that when people die, it is not right. It feels so wrong. That's why we cry at funerals. We have a sense that the brokenness of this world is not meant to be this way. We are set with eternity in our hearts, but we can't fathom what God's really completely done. We can definitely be excited about heaven, but at the same time, there's a certain amount of difficulty in describing heaven. In this series, man, it's wrecking me because it's difficult to use words that I have and access to tools I have. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not yet, but I've not been to heaven, so I can't give you any firsthand account, right? I'm writing as a blind man to blind folks. Like, we haven't seen it. We have texts about what people have written about it. We have what Jesus has said about it. But I have no idea a way to really give it to you. And so as I struggled and worked with the tension of concept of heaven, I wanted to understand, because I know it's difficult for you to wrap your minds around, and I have about 30 minutes to speak to you about it each week, so a total of an hour and a half over the next 3 Sundays. What can I get across that's most important, and how can I maybe put a little hunger in your belly for you to dig deeper and to read further, and to not accept maybe what's been handed to you? Now, we're told about this idea of baby food, that we shouldn't stay on baby food or on milk, that we should seek to learn. Unfortunately, we tend to be people of the path of least resistance, and we tend to just always take the path of least resistance. So unfortunately, some of you, and we come from all different backgrounds, some of you have been in church just since Easter. Some of you just started in Easter. Some of you have been in our church for 5 years. Some of you have been in our church for 15 or 20 years. Some of you have been in the bigger church your whole life. So we all have different backgrounds. Some of you come from backgrounds where it was very defined, and this is the only way to think about heaven, and everything else is wrong, even though generations of Christians thought differently. And millions today think differently, but are still creedal Christians. They still fall within the creed we just studied. Sometimes people talk about biblical heaven as if there's one way to look at it from the Bible. Anyone that is a serious student of the Bible knows that that is impossible and knows that there's actually not that much data that we have. And so we are all grasping at straws here to use our language to define the indefinable, to try to put into human concept and words something that is beyond our capacity. We can't create it, we can't define it, we can't reverse engineer heaven, so how can we then talk about it? And many of us are on a cultural journey that is uniquely American, that has put a Western spin or an American spin on the concept of heaven that might miss the fullness of what God really desires for us. If John were here today, or the Apostle Paul were here with us, and they were talking to us, they would say, most definitely, heaven is about new creation, the renewal of our present world, rather than abandonment and replacement. Now, I know that growing up, my concept, at least, of what I got from what I heard and read, what little I read, was that heaven was this place that we go to, that we're transported to off of planet Earth. And I never really understood the concept of heaven and earth coming together in a new heaven and a new earth. That was kind of foreign to me. Heaven was a different kind of idea. I don't want today to say your way of thinking about it or someone you heard teach on it is wrong, because I don't really think that. I think there's just different ways to kind of describe the same thing. But I think what we would benefit from is a renewed perspective, if you would, a fresh perspective on heaven. Not that it's new, actually it's ancient. We need to rewind and understand what the first Christians thought about heaven, I think. I think maybe in time it's become a little bit stretched and a little bit pushed, or maybe even condensed too much to where we lose some of the beauty of what God intended for us to understand about the afterlife. And so I hope that through this series, you will have a hunger to learn more. And no matter where you land in the end, what you believe about it, understand there's lots of Christians that believe different things about this, because there is some mystery here that we can't fully comprehend, and there is some ambiguity that is not completely spelled out. I will give you what I find most compelling, but I'm not saying that if you don't want to sign on to that, that you're not in God's family or anything like that. I just want to give you kind of where I've gone with it and the fresh perspective that I think is owed heaven, and how that changes the way you live in this world when you understand heaven as more than a place that we go to later. Now, I'll give a warning again. Buckle up. I'm going to disable the ejection seat. What I am telling you, I have not created on my own. What I'm telling you, you will read for yourself in the Bible. The conclusions based on that will be yours, because we have sole freedom to do as such. This series may, however, challenge some of your closely held beliefs about heaven that maybe you've held for a long time, and that can be disorienting, right? You know, learning something new can be disorienting. So if that is the case, I want to challenge you not to fight it immediately, but to consider it, to read on it, to learn, to be open to the Spirit's direction, and to listen to it, and then make a valid decision on that. Perhaps the best part of this is that you don't really have to change anything, is what I think. I've never really changed anything. It's just like looking at the same picture, but from a different angle. It would be kind of like, in my opinion, if you were looking at a really, really fancy piece of artwork from the side, and you were looking at it this way, and you see it, but you don't really appreciate it. You know that there's paint there, and there's something going on, but when you come full face with it, and you just go, oh, wow. That's much more beautiful than I imagined, because I see all that the artist intended, not just kind of the side of it. And so that's kind of what I think of in this perspective. Let's start with probably the clearest picture of the afterlife, which is in Revelation 21. Now, the question I want you to ask yourself as I read this to you is, does this sound like what I think heaven is like? Does this sound like my conception of heaven, okay? We'll begin in chapter 21 of Revelation, and beginning in verse 1, and we'll go to verse 6. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, 'Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever.'" Just pointing out a couple of things there that already start to shake the foundation of what I've heard about heaven sometimes. The new earth, the new heaven, Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. God living with his people could have been said the other way, couldn't it? We going to live with God. But it said God is coming to live with his people. Verse 4, one of my favorite verses, he will wipe every tear from their eyes, so there's evil loses. Verse 5, "And the one sitting on the throne said, 'Look, I am making everything new.' And then he said to me, 'Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true.' And he also said, 'It is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To all who are thirsty, I will give freely from the springs of the water of life.'" John the Revelator writes about what we can expect in the afterlife in this book. And the language is difficult in Revelation. If you've ever gotten bogged down in Revelation, you know. But this part is pretty clear, and it's really one of the clearest texts we have of what afterlife looks like. But to me, this doesn't sound so much like heaven, like where you go when you die. This sounds like a different concept. I mean, God's coming to us. He's coming down out of heaven. That's very interesting. So if I were to say, this is kind of how I remember as a kid being taught, that Jesus has been raised from the dead, therefore we are going to go to heaven to be with him. And I think there's scriptural evidence for that. Jesus hangs on the cross. "Today you will be with me in paradise," he says to the thief on the cross. So there's evidence of that. There's a lot more of that. There's these ideas that we'll be with him. And so I think we can say, yes, that statement rings true, that it's been taught for a long time. But is it not also true that Jesus has been raised, therefore he's bringing heaven back when he returns? Because that's exactly what Revelation just said to you. It is descending out of heaven to us. God is coming to live with us. That's interesting, isn't it? That's an interesting way to look at that, because I think we can also say this is true. Now, here is where it gets sticky. Can both things be true? Now, my brain says no. Like, you can't put two things together that are complete opposites and it be true. Can we say we go to heaven and also that Jesus is bringing heaven and earth together? Does that make any sense? Well, no, that creates what's called a paradox, doesn't it? That is a paradox. Now, if you read the Bible very much, you will realize there is quite a bit of paradox in the Bible. Being born again is a paradox. Like, that language doesn't make a lot of sense to us. Being resurrected, I've never seen anybody resurrected. I doubt you've seen anybody resurrected. Come see me afterwards if you have. But that doesn't make a lot of sense. That is a paradox for us. So getting comfortable with paradox is part of what this requires. But I want to go a little bit further. I looked and looked and looked. Now, I've been studying this for like 24 and a half years. And I really don't think I would ever say that I gave up one vision for another. I just think it expanded. I think the art example works for me really well. I think I was seeing it from one angle, and now I see it more full, and I appreciate it much more from this perspective. But I will say, I've never seen a scholarly article or book anywhere put it in visual format. Anybody else a visual learner? Like, I love visuals. I need visuals. And words are okay, but man, visuals just make it pop from like an infographic any day over like 400 pages, right? So no one has put this in a visual that I can understand. I found one visual from an academic guy, and it confused me more than if he hadn't done it at all. It was terrible. It looked like it was done in Microsoft Paint, and it had like, you know, like how you're supposed to flow chart. Some of you know how to flow chart. Like, there's certain designs that are supposed to mean something. He just went willy-nilly with this thing. He's got diamonds over here and upside-down triangles, and I'm like, stop it. So it was bad. So I made my own. I am not an artist. I just want to put that out there, right? This helps me. It may not help you. I hope it doesn't confuse you, but I made a very simple diagram to try to understand this, because we have to break this down and understand this a little bit. And so I want to give you what I've done, okay? So all of the caveats aside, it may not help you, but maybe it will. So here's what I'm calling my human timeline. We are born. Yes, I got 1 point. All right, diagram part 1. We are born at a certain time. This is how I understand time, right? We are on a timeline. So we are born. And then, secondary to that, we have a life. We live our life, and you are here, like at the map at the mall. So you are here, and we live our life, and that's the time you and I are sharing together right now. We are living our life. But at some point, we expire. Our death is coming. It is prescribed for every one of us to die. Every single one of us will die. We don't know when that is, and there's really no way of predicting that. And so that happens at a certain point. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Heaven is the word that is used culturally, and even in the church, really, most of the time. Heaven is what's used as what comes next, the afterlife. And we're not alone in that, right? Other cultures think of afterlife. Other religions talk about life after death. And so, but we use heaven as this kind of, and I would argue that we kind of encompass everything that happens post-death as heaven. Like in the same way, I could have covered birth and life and death and said a life, right? I could have used one word to cover all of that, even though there's a lot of distinctions in there. There's a lot of difference between being born and living your life as an adult and living your life as an adult or a child and dying, right? Those are different things. But I could have said life. Now, heaven, I think, encompasses a couple of concepts I want to share with you. And this may be the new concept for you, because it was new for me a few years ago. And it is what is called scholars call it the intermediary state. Okay, and this is what you read in the Old Testament about a place called Sheol. It is the land of the dead. In the New Testament, the word in Greek is Hades or Hades. Those two places are not heaven or hell. Now, in some translations of the New Testament, it has been mistranslated. Hades has been mistranslated into hell, which has confused generations of Christians. But that is not a proper translation we know today. That is not that area. Hades is some sort of place where only spirits go, or maybe if we were to say souls. It is not the final resting place, but it is a place after death. I think, personally, paradise is pretty close to that, what Jesus is talking about, to the guy on the crucifix, because he says, today you'll be with me in paradise. Regardless, it is non-physical. It is spiritual only. The intermediary state is unique because we don't have a ton of data on it, but it is completely different from heaven. It is not heaven or hell. It is an intermediary state where everyone is before resurrection. So, if you've never seen these two words before, Old Testament is Sheol. So when you have people talking to dead people in the Old Testament, they're in Sheol. Same place is likely Hades in the New Testament, this concept of a place where people are there before the final resurrection, okay? But it's not heaven or hell. It is a intermediate state. Now, the creed that we just studied had a line that some of you found disconcerting, and that is that Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried, and he descended to hell, it says in some translations. More modern scholarship has shown that that was Hades. So some Christian denominations use the word Hades, but it's probably best translated in English, he descended to the dead. This is where Jesus would have been prior to the resurrection, post-death, prior to resurrection. We have that he preaches to the folks in Hades. So the imprisoned spirits. Jesus descends to the dead. So there we have more evidence as to what this is, even from the first Christians, first century church here talking about Hades, a place where Jesus was in the intermediate state. Crucifixion, Friday, resurrection, Sunday, Holy Saturday, that's the intermediate state, okay? For Jesus, it was very quick. But there's something there to that. So, back to the beautiful diagram. Thank you for that wonderful art. Intermediary state is before really this final concept that I think most closely we would think of as the cultural concept of heaven, the final resting place in the afterlife. Now, Jesus says in John 14:23, all who love me will do what I say. My Father will love them, and we will, both the Father and the Son, we will come and make our home with each of them. Now again, this pushes back on that idea that you may have culture that we go to heaven. And this says, in the end, God is coming to us. It reinforces Revelation. So we read Revelation at the end of the Bible. We read this in John, what Jesus teaches here. And all of a sudden we have this idea that God is bringing this new heaven and new earth that is not separate from each other, but is at the same time, in the same place, in the same space, to be united. So the final part then would be the resurrection. And this is when there's a new heaven, there's a new earth, and we have physical bodies, because the physical bodies are what exists. Just like when Jesus was walking around, he had a physical body. They were able to touch him. They were able to see him. He looked a little bit different to some of them, but it was Jesus' physical body, not spiritual only, not a soul only. And this new heaven and new earth, in some way that I can't fully wrap my head around, is the place where those new resurrected bodies exist. Now, maybe this creates a little bit of a logjam up here for you, like it does most at first. I'll say it like this most clearly. I took my wife's car in for service this week, and I was checking the car in, and they said, we're going to need it for about an hour and a half to fix all the stuff. And I said, okay. And they said, do you want a loaner car, or do you want to wait here? And I'm like, I'll wait here. But as I looked outside, I saw the loaner cars, and the loaner cars were exactly like my wife's car, except they had emblazoned on the back, this is a courtesy car. I was like, so I won't steal it, I guess. And I think, in my way of thinking, that's kind of what the intermediate state is about. It's like a courtesy car. It's not the end result, but it's this kind of loner moment. It's an awkward moment. It's not the final. In the New Testament, we see a lot of talk about this age that we live in and the age to come. Or some translations say this world and the world to come, or the next world. You and I are made for more than this world. We get a sense of that in our daily grind. We get a sense deep down in our guts that this is not all there is. We get a sense that we're made for more. And the things that we dedicate ourselves to, love and justice and mercy and peace, are preparing us for the age to come. And the more that we focus on the self and me, and mine, the less we are prepared for the age that is to come. Because this is an evil age, and it is ending. But the age to come is one that lasts forever. We have a hint of something grander waiting for us. And so how we live in this world today impacts how we will experience the afterlife, how we will be prepared or unprepared for what is to come. Jesus said it like this in Luke. He said, the people of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection of the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage. So next Sunday, I'm going to talk about this age. Next Sunday, we're going to walk deeper into this age and how we are preparing for the next part. We'll talk about birth, death, life, death, and the intermediary state next Sunday, this age. And in the age to come, in week 3, we will focus on how do we live in a resurrected world? What does that look like? And what does today matter for that? Are they connected? And I believe they are connected. So that's in 2 weeks. As we close today, I want you to focus in on this question, because it's really where I started with this whole series. How could thinking about heaven help you live your life on earth differently? How could it help you live your life differently? I am afraid, and people have said this as critics of the church, that we can be so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good. Perhaps you've heard that criticism before. That we're so focused on what's coming that we forget that this is how we prepare for what's coming. That beauty and justice and good and mercy and peace and serving others and maximizing Christ and minimizing self is so critical right now, because it prepares us for the life that we'll live for eternity. Ignoring that would be such a tragedy. So, think of ways that thinking of how all this connects together, your life today, how you treat others now. As C.S. Lewis said, we've never passed anyone that's not immortal. We've never looked at another soul, another human that's not immortal. And so we are either loving people, which will echo throughout eternity, or we are committing terrible crimes, which will stain us for so long and doesn't need to happen that way. We should take account of how we live now, because it prepares us for this new heaven, this new earth, living in resurrected bodies.